working there in it, and most importantly about relationships. And I think you will hear from this panel what those essential relationships look like, what those elements are, and instead of the end of it era, hopefully the foundation for the next one. So with that, we'll turn it over to our panel. It's all yours.
Thank you very much, Stuart, for that wonderful introduction. We are going to talk about relationships, famous relationship between two former presidents, and then the relationships among all of us as citizens of this country. So let's begin with the President George H.W. Bush, President Bill Clinton relationship. Their friendship became famous, really, in recent years, but they had some kind of incipient relationship going back to the 1980s. And Jean, could you tell us a little bit about how that started?
First of all, I sort of feel like the flight attendant on my plane last night. I know you had other choices of events you could attend. Thank you for attending ours. Stephanie and I were afraid that nobody would show up, so we already feel very close to all of you who are here. So the odd couple, as they became known, after they both left office, there is a famous story that President Clinton, but why don't you tell the story of 1983, because it's your boss's story, really.
Okay. Well, in 1983, Vice President Bush, correct, 1983, had a barbecue at Walker's Point for all of the governors. So Governor Clinton, Mrs. Clinton, and 3-year-old Chelsea were at the barbecue. And Chelsea was very excited about meeting the Vice President. So President Clinton introduced her to the Vice President. And the first thing she said was, "Where's the bathroom?" And wonderful, sweet Vice President Bush at that time insisted that he took her by the hand and took her into the house to use the bathroom. And that gesture, I think, just really meant so much to President Clinton. He tells that story over and over. And again, just that he would take the time to do that and do that for this little girl, I think really meant a lot.
And then there was the Education Reform Summit right here in Charlottesville.
That's right.
What happened there?
When President Bush was president, actually the 30-year anniversary of the Education Summit is this September. And it was right here in Charlottesville, Virginia. At that time, I was working for First Lady Barbara Bush. So I was not in the middle of that summit. But then Governor Clinton of Arkansas took a leadership role among the governors and worked really close with the president and his administration on the Education Summit. And President Clinton does not know this yet, but we're going to ask him to help us commemorate the 30th anniversary of the Education Summit here in Charlottesville, because it really was the beginning of an effort by every subsequent president, whether it's No Child Left Behind or different programs to try to improve education in this country. So they got along well then. And then there was 1992.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, we're not going to go there. A very dark time. No. You could say the friendship fell apart during the 1992 election. They weren't close then.
No. So we will at least say it was a pretty tough campaign. President Clinton defeated President Bush in a tough race. But even then, the relationship was unusual because on Inauguration Day, as the Bushes prepared to leave the White House and President Clinton was being inaugurated, President Bush wrote a letter to the new president. I'm just going to read it here for a little context. President Clinton, when he arrived at the White House following the inauguration, found this in the Oval Office on the desk. And it says, it was handwritten, it says, "Dear Bill, when I walked into this office just now, I felt the same sense of wonder and respect that I felt 4 years ago. I know you will feel that too. I wish you great happiness here. I never felt the loneliness some presidents have described. There will be very tough times, made even more difficult by criticism you may not think is fair. I'm not a very good one to give advice, but just don't let the critics discourage you or push you off course. You will be our president when you read this note. I wish you well. I wish your family well. Your success is now our country's success. I am rooting hard for you. Good luck, George. So that letter might be hard to imagine between some of our other presidents. And what can you tell me, Gene, what can you tell me about that letter and how you think he came to the decision to write it that way, and maybe what that says about his background, his values?
President Bush, first of all, he was a famous letter writer. In fact, we did an entire book called All the Best, which is full of all the letters he had written. We started with his letters from World War II back home to his mother, and then all the way through the rest of his life. It's a lost art. He loved to write letters. At the end of the day, President Bush, I hate to sound a little sappy, but he was a patriot. And country first. He lost, President Clinton won, and he got that. And he was taught not to be a sore loser by his mom growing up and his father. You'll also be interesting to know, Stephanie, and all of you, he blamed Ross Perot for his loss in 1992. He and Ross Perot never kissed and made up.
Okay.
Never. But anyway, he felt he was rooting for President Clinton. He wanted President Clinton to succeed because it was more important to him that America succeed than for the man who kicked him out of the Oval Office to fail.
Now, Stephanie, this letter, I think at the time wasn't public, but I suppose it was known in the lore of the Clinton circles. Was there any talk about it at the time?
I don't remember specifically at that beginning of the administration, but I do recall hearing about it and how the tone of that letter, and especially the last line, where President Bush says that he is rooting hard for President Clinton, and because his success will determine the country's success. And I think going to what Gene said about putting country first, and it's not about the person who occupies the office, it's really about our country. And I think that really meant a lot to President Clinton. And I know early on in the administration, on a variety of initiatives, President Clinton relied on the advice of former presidents. He called President Nixon. I know he talked to President Bush, and as you may remember on NAFTA, he brought all the living former presidents together and felt it was important to understand different perspectives. And I think he really valued the experiences of the former presidents and he took President Bush at his word that he was rooting for him. And I think that letter set the tone that he could call on his predecessors for advice and counsel, and thought it was very important.
I'm only speculating, but I imagine President Obama and President Trump are not chatting a lot.
I think you could be right.
Even on important policy matters. But so President Clinton served his 8 years, and now they're both in the club of former presidents. And the Bushes went to the Clinton Library dedication. Gene, were you there?
I was not there.
Stephanie,
I was not there.
I was there. And a lot of people say it was one of the best days of their lives. To me, it was kind of a mixed bag. There was a little weather issue that kind of
big weather
it
issue.
rained on our parade.
Yeah.
But can you tell us something about that day?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as you may know, President Clinton suffered his heart attack about 6 weeks earlier, and so it was kind of a difficult, period as he was coming out of that. But despite the rain, it was really a tremendous celebration of, I think, of our country and sort of the nonpartisanship, the ties that bind us, and seeing, I think, the former presidents and first ladies together is a powerful symbol to everyone. And again, having them all come together. I remember when President Clinton in 1997 went to, and Mrs. Clinton at the time went to the opening of the Bush Library, and it's a celebration. If you think about the presidential libraries, I think they really are our best history museums, that they are a snapshot in time of what was happening in America and around the world. And I think it's really important that all former presidents attend those, and again, show that the power of coming together and show the power of our democracy. I think it was a very powerful symbol. Yes, it was very rainy. And a little funny story that Jean will probably remember. We were debating back and forth. We had a big a big canopy over the stage because the weather forecast was really spotty. The night before, the weather was absolutely perfect when everybody got to come in and have tours of the library. The next morning, when Air Force One landed, President Clinton and President Bush were both like asking for minute-by-minute updates on the weather forecast. And it looked like there was going to be a small window during the time of the ceremony when the rain was going to hold off. So against the advice of their schedulers and their advance people, they decided and instructed the advance people to take the canopy off the stage during the ceremony because they, thought it was more appropriate for everything to be out in the open. Well, obviously you know that as soon as the ceremony started, it began raining and raining, and with each progressive speaker, the rain started, raining even harder. So by the time President Clinton spoke, it was literally a downpour. But that being said, it was a tremendous day, and a lot of folks remember it very fondly.
So that relationship, continued, and they got past the 92 campaign. And then a couple of things happened. There was the funeral of Pope John Paul II.
Yeah, that was later. Too early for the Pope funeral.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
The tsunami.
The tsunami.
And President George W. Bush, the younger President Bush, was a bit of a matchmaker there. Can you tell us about that?
I can. The story's definitely not about me, but
A tiny little bit.
A little bit, because it changed my life for the disaster work. So while most of us were celebrating Christmas in 2004, a devastating tsunami hit South Asia. And it was devastating. Hundreds, so I can't remember the final death toll, but it was tens of thousands of people. And I was actually in Santa Fe, New Mexico for New Year's Eve weekend. And on New Year's Eve, I had a voicemail from Karl Rove saying, I need for you to call me ASAP. I have a question about your President Bush, President Clinton, and the tsunami in South Asia. And I remember thinking, this is not good. I don't think this is. So what the President of the United States wanted, the United States government was obviously going to send help and aid, but the problem was what President Bush, the current president, what the president wanted was to raise significant money in the private sector to help these countries. And he decided the best two people to do this was his father and President Clinton, to bring together, these two polar opposites, and they both said yes. And we don't even know how much money we raised because the idea was we did not set up a foundation. They were just supposed to encourage them to give money to organizations like CARE, like the International Red Cross, like Doctors Without Borders. However, $10 million worth of money showed up in our offices. I would open the mail and there would be $1 million check. It was stunning. We raised $10 million, literally came into our offices. So they raised a lot of money. They agreed to go. The president asked them to go to South Asia in February to meet with all the presidents and prime ministers and to tour the devastated sites and to come back and report back to him what was going on in all these countries. And I will tell you, I went with them, and we got on that plane as amicable colleagues, and President Bush and President Clinton came home best friends. And it began, sometimes it's the little things in life, It began with the fact we were on a government plane, there was one bedroom, therefore there was one bed, and President Clinton insisted that President Bush take that bed. And it was love forever after that. and my part in that, with all due respect, Stephanie, I stayed up all night playing the card game, Oh Hell, with
Right.
President Clinton. So while President Bush was sleeping, the rest of us were playing cards with President Clinton. But it was amazing watching them. President Clinton, we didn't know it then, but I'm pretty sure President Bush probably was in the early stage of Parkinson's. We did not know it then, but he had really slowed down and he was moving rather slowly, and President Clinton was very protective of him. But the other part of this, the whole father figure issue, I think everyone here knows that President Clinton has an issue with staying on time.
What? What are you talking about?
I don't blame the scheduler. President Bush is often the first person there. He's the opposite. He's early, and President Clinton was late. So it drove President Bush crazy that President Clinton would be late, or we would be at an event and it would be time to leave, and President Clinton is still talking. So President Bush became his puller. Because I said to his chief of staff at one point, Laura Graham, I said, President Bush said, we need to go, we're running late. And Laura said, nobody pulls them. No one can pull them. And so I went and told President Bush, he said, really? Watch this. And he walked up to President Clinton, and President Clinton like turned around, and President Bush said, Bill, we're leaving. And President Clinton said, oh, okay.
Now,
So we stayed on time. Can I tell one more funny
you can,
story
but then
about
I'm
your
going
boss?
to defend my boss a little bit because he gets a bad rap, and there's a reason.
No, it's endearing.
Okay, go ahead.
So on this trip, President Clinton, as we progressed, we were gone for about a week, and he really tried to do better. And we're in Thailand. It's first thing in the morning. The motorcade's getting ready to leave. President Bush is in the car. It's a little obnoxious. He's reading a book. I'm on the porch of the place where we stayed, and President Clinton came out, and he is almost on time. He's maybe 5 minutes late. And he looks at the car, and there's President Bush, and he said under his breath, can I curse?
Sure.
He said, oh, shit. He was so desperate to be on time. But anyway.
Well, one of the things President Clinton, as you know, is so really famous for is sort of really connecting with people. And if he's talking to you, you have his full attention. He's not looking around. He's
Right.
not, seeing who else is there. And part of the reason, and frankly, we learned when I was the president's director of scheduling in the White House, we learned to adapt to that. And there were some techniques that we used on the schedule. But he will not walk away from someone unless they've felt like they've had the opportunity to say what they wanted to say. And I think it's just, it's really one of the things that people find most endearing about him as well. But I get it, it's a catch-22. We had some little techniques about how we put things on the schedule, how long they actually were when, maybe something said on the piece of paper was an hour and a half when in reality it was an hour. So we got better.
So they really bonded over the tsunami, and what happened is they became the disaster duo.
Absolutely.
Because we went to South Asia in February 2005, and Katrina hit New Orleans in August of 2005, right before Labor Day. And Labor Day weekend, and they immediately
Got the band back together.
got the band back together, and we founded the Bush Clinton Katrina Fund. And we actually went to Houston Labor Day weekend. President Bush was in Kennebunkport. We couldn't go to New Orleans. It was too soon. They didn't need two former presidents there. We went to Houston, which had opened her doors to 300,000 refugees. It was huge and overwhelming, and President Bush wanted to go to Houston Labor Day weekend just to wave the flag. And he said to me, I think we need to call Bill and invite him to go with us. And he came, and Hillary, Senator Clinton came as well. And I do remember Senator Clinton brought a couple of senators with her. And she came from Washington with a couple of senators, and we're sitting at a table. The presidents and the senators are sitting at a table like this. We began with a meeting with Houston governance people saying, how the hell are you going to handle 300,000? I mean, 300,000 people literally landed on the doorstep of Houston, Texas after Katrina. So they were just saying, what are you going to do? What do you need from us? What do you need from us? And I was sitting toward the end by Mrs. Bush, and she leaned over and she said, who's that senator over there? I don't know him. And it was Barack Obama. And there's this wonderful, I teased her about that. That would have been 2005. And anyway, so they were off and running. We raised $150 million for Katrina, and the two of them went to New Orleans. I don't know how many times, half a dozen times. They gave the commencement address at Tulane that year. They went to the first New Orleans Saints home football game that year. They went to the Super Bowl that year. They became traveling buddies.
Yeah.
And that friendship, so it was interesting. I'm going to turn you in. It was a very good question. So we had a conference call Friday afternoon, and we were talking about the friendship. And particularly in this day and age of TV and social media, you wondered out loud, was it a friendship for public consumption, which would have been okay? Or how deep was the friendship?
Right.
So now I'm going to tell one of my favorite stories about President Bush. So John Paul II dies, and he was a big deal. He was, all the presidents really credited Pope John Paul II with helping to end the Cold War, and he had been a can't say that word. He had been a game changer during his time period. So the president was still 43, and he really thought he was going to go to the funeral, and he really wanted to take all the former presidents with him as an expression of America's sorrow at the passing of John Paul II. So he called his dad and said, what do you think of this idea? And President Bush says, I think that's a great idea. President Ford couldn't go, and President Carter couldn't go, but 41 was going to go. President Clinton's then chief of staff, Laura Graham, called me, and President Clinton had just had another heart surgery, open heart surgery. And Laura said, he may not go. He cannot go. He can't travel. He can't do anything. The doctor has forbidden him to go anywhere, much less, Rome. Can't go to Rome. So for some reason today, President Clinton has said to Laura Graham, I think I'm going to call George, meaning George Bush, to see if he thinks I can go to Rome. They really were, it was a father-son relationship. I mean, it really was like, I'm going to call Dad, see what he says. So Laura calls me and said, oh my gosh, President Bush has to tell him he can't go. And I said, we got this. He's calling, like in 2 minutes. I said, okay, President Bush is here. I will go tell him. So I run to President Bush's office. I tell him the whole thing. I said, you have got to tell President Clinton he needs to listen to his doctors and stay home. And President Bush says, I got this. So President Clinton calls, and he's not on speakerphone, so I just hear President Bush's side of the conversation. And here's what I hear. Well, Bill, I think you can go to Rome. I would really like for you to go. It'd be really fun for you to go, because George, meaning the president, is going to meet with all these other people, and we can hang out. It'd be fun. And I'm standing there going, and President Bush is like, and then he says, we're going on Air Force One, and they have that great medical unit, and so President Bush gets off the phone. He says, great news, Bill's going. And I'm like, oh, God. And sure enough, my next phone call was from Laura Graham, and she said, what the hell just happened? I said, I don't know. I did my best. And President Clinton did go to Rome.
And it all turned out.
It all turned out. They had a wonderful time. There was a little bit of a junior high aspect about it, about why I want Bill to go. And anyway, they became very good friends. And I'm going to tell you one more story from the funeral that has nothing to do, by then they were called the odd couple. And internally, the Bush family called President Clinton a brother by another mother, was his nickname inside. So picture this, Air Force One lands in Rome about midnight Rome time. the presidential motorcade, and the three presidents, so it's two President Bushes, President Clinton, get in the president's car to race to the Vatican. The first thing they do, John Paul II is lying in state in St. Peter's through the night, and the American delegation, led by the president and two former presidents, go straight to the Vatican to pay their respects. I was not on the trip. I'm watching on TV in my office, and when I saw the three of them walk in, I did start crying. It was it was very touching and very impressive. So what happened so they come out of St. Peter's, it's like 1 a.m., and the President of the United States is staying at the U.S. Embassy. The two former presidents are staying at a hotel. And George W., he may be the president, but he's also a son. Mm-hmm. And he said, okay, Dad, I'm going to give you and Bill a ride to your hotel. And the two of them was like, no, you don't take a presidential motor. No, George, you go on. We'll be fine. We have cars here. And George W., I've heard him talk about this, and he was very uncomfortable leaving two former presidents standing in St. Peter's Square at 1 a.m., one of whom is his dad. And he tries to get him in the car, and they're like, no, go. So the Secret Service is my source on this great story. So the presidential motorcade roars out of St. Peter's Square, and there is not one car left. In the St. Peter's Square is two former presidents and a lot of really panicked Secret Service agents. Their motorcade is nowhere to be found. To make a long story short, they found it. It was somewhere in Rome, and they got home, and all was well. But they should have gotten in the car with the president.
They should have.
Anyway.
It was probably a lot more fun.
A lot more fun. Yeah, they thought it was funny. Mm-hmm. They said, we can call a cab.
Stephanie, on the decision for President Clinton to go on that trip so soon after his surgery, was the story a little different on the Clinton end of things?
Not really. It was pretty much exactly as Gene told you the story. Like, he said that, he came back after a lot of conversation among the staff and the doctors and said, well, he told me that I have to go. I really have to. It was more like, it would be, for me not to be there would be, kind of an embarrassment. I really need to. So that was kind of the take on our side.
So we've been talking about the development of this really great and unusual friendship between two people who, are former presidents, but then they took it and they accomplished things with the disasters and some other things. Was there ever any discussion of some intentionality about, hey, we have this thing here, how can we use it? Aside from just the general feeling, former presidents, though they are former, they still have power, they can still have impact. Were they much conscious about, hey, the two of us together packs a bigger punch? What can we accomplish here? Was that much on their minds?
I think in the last few years, yes. I mean, it was very natural. There was nothing, as Gene told you these stories, there was nothing sort of about it that was, for the public or, it really was, the friendship was very genuine. And I think clearly the success from the tsunami, Katrina, and then we can obviously talk about hurricane. But it was a real friendship, and it was a great example, I think, of how people that perhaps have opposing views can still find common ground and have enough mutual respect that it is possible to form a friendship. So about 6 years ago, President Bush 43 and President Clinton began talking about the need in our country to have civil discourse, that problem solving and serving in government, it's a noble profession, and that compromise should not be a bad word. I mean, that's how you get things done. So President Clinton and President Bush got together, and we now have a program called the Presidential Leadership Scholars Program, which is a partnership between the Clinton Presidential Center, the Bush Presidential Center in Dallas, the Bush Foundation in College Station, and the LBJ Foundation in Austin. And every year, 60 scholars are selected from thousands of applications. And these are they're more than mid-career professionals. These are people that are making a profound difference in their communities. And the point is to bring a very diverse group of people from all walks of life to participate in this unique leadership program where the problem solving and issues are examined from those 4 presidents and their leadership styles and how they were able to accomplish things against very difficult circumstances. So the model of the friendship really between the 3 presidents, the 2 President Bushes and President Clinton, really served as a basis for this really wonderful program. We're about to celebrate our graduation of the 5th year of Presidential Scholars. And I think what makes this program so unique, again, first of all, the money has been raised to support this program, so there's no cost to the scholars, which again really makes it truly diverse. And when I say diverse, I mean from diverse geographically, from all parts of the country, from all sectors. And you have these people that come together, and they have really incredible access. They have conversations with President Clinton and President Bush, and they were so lucky last year to be able to have a conversation with President Bush and Mrs. Bush in College Station. And they get to meet with former advisors, and wow, that's all really special, and they learn these great lessons. But what they say is, and every class has said this, what has been the most transformational and the most remarkable part of the program is to have this really special opportunity to engage on a really deep and meaningful basis for 6 months with people that they would have never come in contact with in their daily lives. People that are completely on the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of how they think about challenges and solving problems. And it's transformational. I really think we need more of that in our country, and we need to be able to put aside whatever our smaller differences are and figuring out how to come together and have a sort of a respect in our common humanity and respect people and want to reach out to people where they are. And that's, again, it was all modeled on this unique friendship between the 2 former presidents and then obviously the 3 of them.
Well, you know, go ahead, Jean.
I was just going to say, when they traveled on the tsunami trip, what we heard, and they did a couple of funerals together as well. Can't remember now which ones. I know the King of Morocco. But one of the things I heard being on the tsunami trip with them is people in other countries were stunned to see the 2 of them together. And what we heard over and over again was, this would never happen in our country. You would never see 2 political rivals come together, travel together, be kind to each other. So I love the question that you asked. It made me wish that maybe we had done something more profound with it, but I love your answer because I think we did. It just the Presidential Scholars Program, but just the example we set for the rest of the world and the country was amazing. And I wish it was a lesson that we could reteach, bring it, maybe we need to run some old video.
And don't forget, President Carter and President Ford actually became very good friends.
They also were good friends, yeah.
That is, you know, well, the Sorensen Institute where I work, at the center of our programs, we bring together politically diverse people. They're diverse every which way, including geographically, but most importantly, ideologically.
Right.
And we basically force them to deal with each other in this program that lasts through the course of a year, and they cannot help but discover each other's humanity and the values that they have in common. And they argue and fight, but they do it in a way that is respectful, and they build these friendships that are less famous, but equally as unlikely as the 2 presidents that we've described. And it's one of the most gratifying things about the work we do, and I think it pays off over time in the politics of Virginia and beyond. You mentioned obviously the Bush-Clinton partnership, and then you mentioned Ford and Carter, and the surprise that people had that they would be not just working together but friendly and civil to each other. Both of them, I think it's fair to say, while they at times in their presidencies were could be a source of division in their personal styles, they were consensus builders, or tried to be, and sometimes it didn't always work, Sometimes it worked out badly on the political side, but that seemed to be something that they tried to do, both of them. And that in those times when they were running and when they served, there was some political advantage to that as well. And I wanted to ask you to comment on whether those incentives have changed. For presidents going forward, is there much political value in being a consensus builder and being a person who compromises and reaches across the aisle in our current politics?
Well, it's a travesty that you even have to ask that question.
Sure.
So President Bush was a one-term president, and the Democrats controlled the Senate and the House all 4 years of his presidency. So he had no choice but to reach across the aisle. And there was some major accomplishments along the way. But we won't even talk about foreign policy, of which there was quite a bit, but he passed the Americans with Disabilities Act. He passed what to this day is still considered the most important piece of environmental legislation, the Clean Air Act. Mm-hmm. And of course, probably the biggest was, which led to him losing in 1992, was the 1990 budget deal, in which George Herbert Walker Bush had to break his 1988 campaign pledge, read my lips, no new taxes. I cannot tell you how many times he would love to have taken that back. But now when all these years later, 30 years later, it's nothing compared to the deficit now, but at that time, the deficit was deemed as out of control and a crisis. And so in return for the Democrats agreeing to budget cuts, the Republicans agreed to tax increase. And President Bush literally wrote in his diary that night, when I read his diary and read this, I thought, oh my God. He literally wrote, I am fairly certain I made myself a one-term president today. Can you imagine, I don't want to be difficult, but is there anyone in Washington, and I'm not talking about the current president, I'm talking about everybody in Washington. It seems like right now, it's always about the next election cycle, and well, I had to do this, I'm going to get reelected. Well, all of us here, who cares if you get reelected? What we care is what's best for the country. And I know President Clinton made I know President Clinton alienated his liberal left by some of what he did, but they both did it because they felt it was the right thing to do for the country.
Right.
So I think somehow, and we'll get back there, we will absolutely get back there, where our elected officials, if we can just remind them that they work for us, and we want them to do what's right for the country. So you can't get me started on this, but because I'll go on for hours and that would be really insufferable, but anyway.
Sort of to follow what you were saying, first of all, President Clinton was governor for 12 years before he became president, so he had to work with the legislature to get things done. And so, again, compromise was, again, part of how you get things done. And I think he recognized on several issues that in order to be able to compromise and find common ground, you had to have a basic understanding of the person with the opposing point of view and a basic respect for that person's point of view. You have to understand the circumstances and the context of why they felt the way they felt. So I know that he always tried to and different advisors have said he knew the opposition's playbook and point of view better than they did, because again, at the end of the day, it wasn't a zero-sum game. It's not my way or the highway, or I'm going to win everything and you're going to lose, and that's how we're going to get things done, which I think sort of is the current, in this current environment, I feel like it's much more polarized, like it's an all or nothing. I win, you lose. I think I know in our administration, it was, everyone's going to have to win a little bit to feel good about where we end up. And, members, that would come over to the White House, he would have meetings behind closed doors with Newt Gingrich and Trent Lott. And he knew that afterwards that they had to go out to the cameras and say some negative things, because that's just the way it works. Or on TV, but guess what? When they came back into the White House and then they went upstairs and they had a drink, they knew that their job was to get things done. And it wasn't going to be all or nothing. It was going to take time, and they were committed to doing what was best for our country. And I hope we can get back to that point.
We'll get back
I
there.
have hope we do.
I think we need to run for president, you and me. Look, we have 50 votes.
Okay.
Okay.
I have 3 teenage daughters at home. I'm not sure how that's going to work out.
Well,
No, I just feel I am the luckiest person in the world that I worked for George Herbert Walker Bush, and I know you feel the same way about President Clinton. What a tremendous role model. And, what I learned something from him until the day he died, literally. He said a couple of things to me in the last couple of weeks of his life that I thought, oh my gosh, we need to find, there are leaders like that out there. They're here at UVA and the work that the Miller Center is doing. And I love the announcement of the new Democracy
really
Center. It's
exciting.
such good news, and we absolutely will get there. The George Bush School of Government and Public Service in College Station, those kids are amazing. They're going to set the world on fire. But we just need to get back to figuring out what's right for the country and not where we become very narcissistic, I think. And civility, in a civil world, there really isn't room for a lot of narcissism.
so we've been talking about this famous friendship between 2 former political opponents, that I suppose is as great a manifestation of civility in American politics as you might imagine. But let's talk a little bit about civility for the American public more broadly, more generally. You said, Gene, we'll get back there, and I tend to agree with you, but I do think we, right now in 2019, maybe lack a little bit of a consensus about what it is we want to get back to. And so I wanted to ask you maybe to talk a little bit about what, the name of our panel was Dialogue and Difference, Nurturing a Modern Civility in American Politics, a modern civility, which I think implies that that's a term that's a little fluid, that can change over time, at least as we understand it. And so what is, right now, what is civility in American public discourse? What are we looking for?
I think we need all to learn to be better listeners. And again, I'm telling you what I learned from President Bush. Who cares what Gene Becker thinks? This is what I learned from President Bush. We need to be better listeners. We need to respect another's opinion. It doesn't mean you have to agree, you don't have to agree with everybody, but at least listen to why they think what they think. And then try to figure out a common ground or a middle ground. One of the things that makes me sad is we're just 2 years away from Hurricane Harvey in Houston, which was obviously devastating to that city. But watching Houston come together during Harvey, why is it we came together after 9/11. And why is it always the worst at times that bring us together? Someone needs to figure out how we can come together in the best of times. It's sort of an odd thought, but we know how to pull together and be a family and be good neighbors when we have to be. But I think the key is just to listen more and to turn off TV and get off social media and read more and get out there in the community more. President Bush would want me to mention be a point of light. be a point of light.
Well, something President Clinton says frequently that really resonates with me is our common humanity matters more than our interesting differences. And I think what he means by that is context matters. So before you judge someone because of what they put on Twitter or maybe their view on something, you have to understand their circumstances. So we need to take more time, as Gene said, and listen to people and understand that people's circumstances may dictate why they feel some way or why they do something or say something. Not that it's an excuse, but again, just having more humanity. And before we're so quick to judge someone or label someone, he also talks about how especially people in government service, are viewed as sort of three-dimensional or cartoon characters. And we need to get back to understanding that people are complicated. And once we establish sort of common respect for one another, perhaps our dialogue can then be more constructive. But listening to other people and understanding, I think, goes a long way in furthering sort of getting back to some kind of a civil discourse where we can have conversations without alienating or hating people, and you can make better decisions and hopefully create a better platform for young people and other people to be able to come together.
So you've both described something that sometimes I call substantive civility. It's more than a mere politeness. It requires some thinking about who it is you're talking with, who you're listening to, what is their story. And we see, I think recently, there's a little bit of a fight going on over the word civility in the public discourse itself. There are people who are very, very focused on kind of politeness and order, and there are people who feel like the very idea of calling for civility is really a way of telling some people just to shut up and stay out of the argument. And we're sitting here in Charlottesville, Virginia, where a couple of years ago we had the Unite the Right event and the racist violence that went with that. And the news media went away, but that's been playing out in our city ever since, certainly in our city council meetings, where it gets pretty raucous and pretty harsh. And once in a while somebody will stand up and say, can't we just be civil to each other? And they say that with perfect earnestness, and then somebody shouts them down and says,
Sure.
No, don't you try to make me shut up. And it's essentially the exchange that happens again and again. What do you think about that? How do we get past that? If it's more than politeness, what else is it? And how do we have a civility that honors, not just order, but also justice?
It's about leadership. It really is about leadership. We can't do this without leadership that starts at the top. And our leaders need to set the example. They need to set the table. And to show, our leaders need to be stronger and have a louder voice than the shock jocks on the radio and on TV. And so I think we need stronger leaders. I think what all of us can do is go to the ballot box. I don't want to know. I don't want to know who you're going to vote for or not vote for. But if every single American does not vote in 2020, shame on them. That's what we can do.
I agree with Jean. I think definitely it starts at the top, and modeling, civil discourse for America, but also to the image that we present to the rest of the world, I think is very, very important. And I think it also has to start at sort of the grassroots level, whether it's at home with parents sort of modeling this to their children. I have 3 teenage daughters, and I know that's something that we talk about a lot. You can disagree with people, you can be disagreeable, but can you also at the same time respect the other person, and again, think about the context and understanding why people may feel the way they feel. I think it needs to happen in local elections. We have to sort of it has to come from the top down, but I also think it has to start at sort of the basic, in homes, in churches, in schools, across the board.
A recent Pew Poll found that a majority of Americans, including majorities of both major parties, agreed with the statement that the members of the other party and their beliefs are a threat to our country. Now, if you believe that, and apparently a majority of Americans do, if you believe that poll, this mission of ours to build civility and a substantive civility is harder. And I think it speaks of a crisis of the perceived legitimacy of our political opponents. We started talking about these 2 presidents who really duked it out in 1992, but never lost sight, I think, of each of the other's legitimacy, and it blossomed into that greater relationship. But it seems that, for just regular folks, this is getting harder to do. How how do we get past this?
The New York Times columnist David Brooks actually wrote an outstanding column about this issue.
And a new book, too.
And a new
Yeah.
book, and I wish I had kept the column, I should Google it. But what he talked about is we've begun to live our life in silos, and social media doesn't help. He said there used to be a time where even a PTA meeting would bring together people from different parts of town and different races and different economic structure. But now, you know, the rich people send their kids to private school, and he says it's like he says we're in silos. We tend to hang out with people who look like us, who think like us, who make about the same amount of money as we do. And he says nobody has conversations anymore that the light bulb may come on, because we just talk to people who agree with us. So it was such an interesting column, and he talked about how we've got to get outside of our comfort zone. And this is where becoming a volunteer, getting involved in the community, I really do think that is key, is we all have to volunteer to get out there. And I go back to Houston and Hurricane Harvey, and how I know some of the richest people in Houston's house flooded. And I know one couple who spent the night in the shelter. They never thought they'd ever spend a night in a shelter, but it was something about Mother Nature can be a very leveling experience, life experience. But Harvey forced Houstonians to get to know each other just a little better. So I think that would be Points of Light. For years we've talked about, we've never done it. I haven't given up on it, to sponsor nationwide what they called Sunday night suppers, where we encourage all Americans to host a dinner party or attend a dinner party, not every Sunday night, but maybe set aside one Sunday every month in which you invite to sit at your table, not your next door neighbors, not your family, not your best friends, but people who don't look like you, who don't think like you, who don't vote like you. So I still hope that we kick that program off.
Well, again, I'm going to go back and put my mom hat on again, because as I mentioned, I have 3 teenagers, 2 girls in high school, and I actually have a lot of hope for the future, because I think that young people, they actually really get it. I think they understand, especially my older girls go to Little Rock Central High School, America's really most famous high school, sadly because of what happened in the late 50s. But now Little Rock Central High School is a place where kids from all walks of life come, and they learn how to interact with each other. They're in clubs together, and I think having young people exposed to lots of different ideas and opinions. And I'll also go back to saying, I think it has to start at home. I think it has to start in the communities. And, another program I think too, again, that brings people from all walks of life together to serve their country is AmeriCorps, which was created, the Corporation for Community and National Service, and where it becomes normal, for kids to want to serve their country. And so hopefully one day, all kids will, try to think about, where am I going to serve and where is my service here? But I think those kind of programs that teach and model this kind of behavior for young people, where they come together, they do things for each other and for their community, and so that becomes normal again. So I think it really does have to start at a younger age. And I do have hope, because I see it in my own community. I see it with my kids and their friends. And I think the more we can contribute to programs like Points of Light or AmeriCorps or Teach for America, all those types of things bring people together instead of tearing people apart. We need to build bridges to each other instead of building walls, frankly.
You've talked about Arkansas, you've talked about Texas, Houston, and of course we've talked about Washington, D.C. Civility in Arkansas, civility in Texas, civility in D.C., or Virginia. Are these different things in the way it actually plays out?
Shouldn't be.
It shouldn't be.
It shouldn't be different things.
It seems though, so I'm old enough that I started, I worked in the Senate as a staff person in the early 90s, initially for Senator Bumpers from Arkansas, and And my last stint in the Senate was just a few years ago, and it was very different from
Different
beginning
place.
to end.
I worked on the Hill in the late 80s, yeah.
There was a lot of just trust across partisan lines when I started, and there's more or less none now. And the staff would date across partisan lines and all this kind of thing, and drink beer across partisan lines in the bars, and it yielded results. But this goes back to what I said earlier about incentives. I think it's harder to do for the elected officials now, and we have cycles here. Some people will say the harshness of our current politics is really just a return to the norm. And we had that prosperous post-war period that allowed us to indulge in some comedy and bipartisanship. I hope that's not true. What do you all think about that?
I think it's so worth it to do that and to reach across the aisle. My friendship with Gene, through the Presidential Scholars Program, having the opportunity to go to Dallas, to the Bush Center several times a year and interact with my colleagues there as we work together to create opportunities for these young leaders from across our country to come together. It's just been so outstanding and enlightening to me, and it's really opened my eyes as well. So I think, again, having more opportunities and putting yourself out there, getting out of the silos. And, again, a lot of it is modeling that behavior. And one of the people that I think is someone who has modeled that behavior from the very first time I met him, I think he snuck in the back of the room, is Mac McClarty back there, who was President Clinton's first chief of staff, and really set the tone for our White House when we all came to Washington. Mac was a very accomplished person in the private sector and was known for his ability to get things done with all different types of constituencies. He had strong relationships across the aisle from his time in a young Arkansas legislator. I think he was the youngest person to serve in the Arkansas legislature. So, watching and modeling that kind of behavior, having leaders like Matt McClarty set the tone, and then having young people that really do care about their country and want to come together and want to solve problems. Like I said, I'm actually filled with a lot of hope.
Again, I'll repeat the power of the ballot box. I'm going to tell a story about President Bush. So he died November 30th. So what was that, 2-3 weeks after the election? And the last public thing he did is he went and voted. Secretary Becker took him to vote and to help him go through the ballot. And he and I had some really interesting races in Texas, some of which made national news, and the famous Beto Ted Cruz race, for example. So President Bush comes back from voting, and I asked him who he voted for, and he was appalled. And he said, "I'm not going to tell you that." Well, for the last 6 months or whatever, really since when Mrs. Bush died in April, I spent every evening with President Bush watching the news. We watched Lester Holt on NBC every single night, the nightly news. And so in November, I should point out he early voted. He voted about a week before the election. So we watched about a week worth of news, and every commercial was a political ad, every single one. And an ad would come on, and President Bush would look at me and go, "I didn't vote for him." I'm like, "Oh, okay." And then another ad would come on, "I didn't vote for him either." And by the time we got through all the newscasts, I knew everybody he had voted for and didn't vote for. But he loved telling me on the ads, he said, "Nope, didn't vote for him either." And you maybe would be stunned at who he voted or didn't vote for. But you know what? He was dying, and he went and voted. And I'm going to be yelling that from the rooftops in 2020. Anyone who says to me, and I may start let's start a movement. You've got to go vote. If you don't vote, then you don't even have any right to complain.
That's right.
Don't even.
That's right.
And I will use him as an example.
Well, amen to that, and that might be a good place to pivot to questions from the audience. We have a microphone here, if anybody would like to ask a question. Don't all rush at once.
Yeah.
I'm an academic, so I have a couple of questions.
A couple.
Uh-uh.
Let me see if I can remember.
Will there be a test after?
Yes, there'll be a test.
Yeah.
So, what are the longest levers that we have for impacting or creating dialogue among us? Are ideas the longest levers? Is the Presidential Ideas Forum? Are ideas the longest levers? Or is there some other way of being together than engaging in ideas? What is it that impedes the formation of dialogical relationships? And you've already said some about this, but where is the infrastructure for common ground among us nowadays?
I think academia, I'm sorry, I'm gonna go.
Again, I think a lot of this, and I keep returning to the chant about young people, I think we need to teach civics. We need to have, people need to be informed on how our government works. Young people need to be equipped with the knowledge of how to get things done. And they need to understand how important their participation is, as Gene talking about voting, and what it means, and what a gift we have in our country. So I think starting at the basics, civics needs to be, the way we teach civics, I think, has to fundamentally change across the board in our country. That would be really sort of the first thing I would say.
I think every sector of society needs to play a role, and we need to do so in partnership. Certainly academia. As I said earlier, what's going on here at the Miller Center is fabulous, and I think there's a lot of universities across the country who are doing similar programs. I think the nonprofit sector has a huge role to play. Again, I'm partial to what Points of Light is doing because President Bush founded it, and I'm on the board. But we are being very aggressive right now about trying to address this divide in society. And getting people out there. I have my best friend in life. He likes to yell at the TV and throw things at the TV and bitch about everything in politics. Well, he is a big Mayor Pete fan. I can't pronounce his name. Buttigieg. And so I signed him up to be a volunteer on the campaign. George lives in New York City, and I went online and I signed him up. And I said, quit talking and get out there. And, volunteer for a campaign, and now he's sort of in a state of shock. But we gotta get off the couch and just get involved. And there's a lot, and just attending, I was looking around the room today, this morning session, and it was packed for Madeline Albright and Steve Hadley. And I'm thinking, and the George Bush Library in College Station does some wonderful events that are usually packed. I know you do wonderful events. I look around the room, just by being here, you're making a difference. You could be home on your computer, on social media, or you could be watching CNN or Fox News, but you're here. Learning, listening, that's what we have to do. I don't know if we answered your question, but
Amen to
we just
that.
got to get out there.
Just to follow up on your question, if I might, you asked about ideas that could help us in being together. I think being together is the idea. Stephanie mentioned the program, the
Presidential Leadership Scholars.
And the Sorensen Institute's programs. A really important and not particularly complicated element of what we do is to just get people who are not normally on the same page politically to be together and understand each other. And it really pays.
I will tell just quickly, and this is sort of out of left field story, but President Bush's last personal aide, who also was a paramedic, a wonderful, wonderful young man named Evan Sisley, was gay. And I tried to hire Evan, I did hire Evan to take the job, and he was scared to death to work for a Republican president. And at some point during the interview, he looked at me and he said, "Are you aware I'm gay?" And I said, "Okay, yes, I don't care. I hate to tell you this, you're not going to be President Bush's first gay aide. He already had a gay aide a couple aides ago." And he was stunned. And Evan, he is such an articulate speaker now. I've served on it. He did the presidential forum.
Right.
What he learned by getting out of his silo as a gay man to go take care of a Republican president. He understood, he is great about talking about this, but he got out of his silo and he's like, oh my God. But he said, you're not anti-gay. And I'm like, no.
Going back to the
We're
labels,
not.
people, right.
Labels. I said, guess what? No, where did that
People
come
are
from?
complicated.
Yeah, labels and stereotyping and anyway.
I swear I
Elite.
didn't mean to say that. One of the connections that I'd like to share, I've never said this in front of Stephanie, but Jean, you've heard me say it forever. But I worked at AIDS for a long, long time and had hundreds of people die. And President Bush and Barbara Bush, nobody gives them credit for that. Now, full disclosure, act up. I mean, I did my part. Okay. But what they did with Ryan White to do that, and then President Clinton tried heroically to get PEPFAR through. And so come George W. Bush. What does President Clinton say to George W. Bush? Get PEPFAR done for me. I tried so hard I couldn't do it. And so the three of them, with Barbara and with Hillary, really have an unsung story there that I think those of us who worked in AIDS, those of us who are gay, have an obligation to share. And I would just like to have that loop closed, because when you guys are sitting there talking about NAFTA, all this other stuff, I'm sitting there going, PEPFAR, which didn't see me. So anyway, I want the people here to know that and the risk that they took, because they certainly knew the impact that was going to blow back on them in the early 80s and the days of AIDS.
Thanks, Alita. That was very sweet.
So I believe I'm a bit too short to reach the microphone, but so as a student, we talked a lot about civic engagement and civic education, and I can see the importance of that. My major is literally government and political science. But I think one of the things I find most frustrating being in school is that many of my classmates, I think I struggle to see them be as motivated, even when they take classes in high school or college that teach them about the importance of voting, the importance of volunteering and engaging in communities. Oftentimes, they find it a lot easier to do what you talked about, sit back and watch Netflix or be on social media. So I think as a student, I see that there is an opportunity and also an onus on us as young people to encourage each other, to push each other out of our comfort zones. But the problem is, I think we feel we are either ill-equipped or find it difficult to maybe challenge people, because we are in a world of polite society where to challenge one another is almost to be seen as to affront one another in a way that's maybe rude or maybe not commonly seen as a good thing. So how can we change the culture of that in a way that maybe pushes us to be willing to challenge each other and say, why are you not voting? Or why do you not care? Or where can you volunteer? And why are you so on your phone?
Well, I think part of it starts where people have a basic understanding of what's at stake for them. So young people need to understand how critical their voice is, that their voice matters, that their vote matters, that their opinion matters. And if they choose to sit on the sidelines, what's at stake? You don't get a seat at the table or a voice, but you're sort of allowing other people to make decisions on your behalf. So I think that basic understanding of civic participation, and again, I think it starts in elementary school and middle school and high school, again, a basic understanding of civics and the principles on which our country was founded. I think that's really vital. And I think young people look for models of people to emulate. So I think it's important, whether it's the President of the United States or your pastor at your church or the high school football coach, I think we need to see models of civility and people having a basic understanding of humanity. And again, looking at models like President Clinton, President Bush, I mean, there are models everywhere if people look, and just having that basic understanding and respect. I think sort of the common humanity, respecting other people's ideas. You may not agree from them, but at least have an open mind and be able to listen, because people are more complicated than they may appear. And again, I think context of why people feel the way they do, people are complicated. And so I think between role models and beginning the education at a very early age, and young people sort of putting a stake in the ground and know that they have an important role to play in their own futures. Thank you.
Here's my advice too, is to think of it in terms of baby steps. You're not going to change your friend's mind or your class's mind. So I would start with your group of friends and just challenge them and say, okay, let's do something. And it may be volunteer for a good cause. It may be volunteer for a presidential campaign, but start small. And certainly this is what we see a lot in Points of Light, where we give a daily Point of Light award every single day to volunteers who've accomplished great things. Well, most of them started on their street or in their neighborhood, and then it kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. The grassroots. Yeah. So start small and think of your subset of friends and say, okay, guys, and hopefully girls, let's go out and do something and make a difference. And then maybe you can go to a class. Just keep growing your audience, and you'll get there.
The rippling effect.
The rippling effect, it's huge.
I would like to challenge you a little bit.
Please.
I think in your question, you evinced a real civility. You were concerned that you might offend people by asking them these things.
That.
And I would say you are mistaken. That is not uncivil. That is just a sign of a good citizen. And so the most important thing you can do is just ask them questions. Instead of saying, get the hell out and vote, say, why is it that you don't vote?
Right.
What do you think is the consequence of that? And start the conversation. And also, I think you should check out the programs at the Sorensen Institute for Political Leadership. See me after. Oh, here's one.
I'm also a student at UVA. So you kept like reaching back to this idyllic past of compromise between leaders. And the phrase that was thrown around a lot was living in your silo and not interacting with people who have had different experiences. Do you think that it's worse today than it was in the past, or perhaps in the past there was less disagreement just because the voices in play it was a more homogenous voice?
I think I'm obsessed with this. I really think social media is one of our big problems here, because what happens is people can get on social media, no matter what the platform, and say whatever they want, and it can be hateful and instantaneous. There's just so much instantaneous. You say something, I may tweet about you on the way to the airport. I can't believe that students, it's like rather than talk to each other, we tweet about each other.
And echo chambers. You're just hearing from people that think just like you.
I do think it's worse, because I think social media can be a wonderful thing, but I think it has been a huge contributor to the polarization of our country. And I also think cable network television. I remember actually Margaret Tutwiler, who was the spokesman for the State Department under President Bush 41. She was briefly in 43's White House. And she told me this amazing story. And of course, this was like 2001. So it's almost, so I can't imagine how fast things had changed. So right after President Bush 43 became president, a US submarine unfortunately surfaced in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of Hawaii and split a Japanese fishing boat like in half. And Margaret said that when 41 was president, they would have gotten a call from the captain of the submarine and said, oh my God, this horrible thing has happened. And President Bush would have called the Prime Minister of Japan, and they would have, and before it ever got out to the public, he would have talked to the Prime Minister of Japan, he would have talked to the captain of the submarine, they would have talked about it. What happened? How did it happen? What were we going to do about it? President Bush 43 literally found out about it on CNN. Is how he found out that an American submarine, because it just moved, because someone, I don't know if it was someone on the fishing boat or on the submarine, called CNN, or they They tweeted it out, and so they were playing catch up the whole time. So I don't think I answered your question. I do think it's worse. Your question was, is it worse? And the answer is yes. And part of it is this instant communication we have. We don't talk anything through. We just let the world know what our opinion is.
People
And
are talking past each other. They're not even
I
talking
love that
to each
really,
other, right? They're
talking past
literally,
each other.
or they're in these echo chambers, and so they don't have an opportunity to listen. No one's listening to a different point of view to figure out, oh, well, maybe I could think about this differently. So I agree, we have to get back to having more conversation and putting ourselves in opportunities to interact with different people and have an understanding of other people's viewpoints. And social media, while you said has a lot of wonderful attributes, it has, I think, contributed to people sort of not being
Listening
able
to
to put
each other.
themselves out there and listen.
I would like to say that I don't think it's the worst it's ever been.
No.
I think it's the worst that it's been lately. You know, say in my lifetime.
In my
perhaps.
lifetime.
Maybe 1861 was worse. But, and I do think the points about social media are very valid. And nor do I would argue with your characterization, or if you understood us to be saying that the past was idyllic. I don't think it was different. And you were absolutely right that the range of people who are in the dialogue now is broader and should be. But there is more going on than that. And actually the invention of the internet in historical terms happened 5 minutes ago. And I think we're still trying to figure out what it means for democracy, and we're having trouble. So that's difficult, but you know, American history goes in cycles, and we try to learn. I do think we're at a particularly bad moment now in understanding each other and in the incentives that prevail in our politics. It takes courage to do the right thing. It doesn't always pay politically to do the right thing, and especially lately, it seems. So particularly when that right thing is to engage with people on the evil other side. And that's the business that we are in every day. And I tell you, it's challenging, but thank you for that very good question.
Let me just, for the young people who are here, I think there's two of you. One of President Bush's pet peeves was when people would say this is the worst of times. That drove him crazy. And he would bring up the Civil War, he would bring up both world wars, he'd bring up the Depression, he'd bring up 9/11. That's crazy, and he's right. He was such an optimist by nature. And one of the things I love about the musical Hamilton is all of America was then reminded of the history of a vice president and a secretary of treasury shooting each other. I mean, it's not that bad now. It's bad, but I don't think Mike Pence and, I can't think of his name, Munchkin are gonna shoot each other. They might, but anyway, it's not the worst of times by any means.
Okay, here's one.
So following up on that point, though, I wonder if it maybe helps to picture that Presidents Bush and Clinton were relatively moderate in terms of their views. How do you think this picture works when, even when we come out of our silos, we just fundamentally disagree? How does civility help us get to an answer?
It's a great point, because we did work for two politically moderate people, and I
think
don't know if I know the answer.
their approach to governing was that it's not a zero-sum game. It's not my way or the highway, or I'm smarter than you, and winner take all. Everyone knew that it was important to compromise. So at the end of the day, we're here to do the best for the American people. And that doesn't always mean that I'm going to get everything I want and you are. We're going to figure it out so that everyone gets something. And don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Maybe, you know, whatever the issue is, it's not going to end up exactly how you intended, but know that the steps you're going to take along the way are moving things forward. And I think we've lost a lot of that. People just see things, it's black or white, it's I'm winner, you're loser, you're painting your opponent as evil. You can't get anything done in that type of environment. So I think, to me, civility is really all about resetting the table and knowing that at the end of the day, everyone has to have some skin in the game.
What'd she say?
Well, if there are no further questions, I'd ask Britt, Stephanie, do you have anything you'd like to say before we wrap up? Or
I
your
love
team?
Jean Becker, she's so great.
I love, see, we're the next generation of bipartisan, stepping up, the Clinton teams and the Bush teams are very close. And, you know, how do you explain that? I love this girl. So, anyway, our bosses passed it down to the next generation.
That's right.
Well, I want to thank you both for that really interesting look inside that relationship and this really interesting, thoughtful discussion we've had about civility. And I want to thank all of you for coming on behalf of the Sorensen Institute for Political Leadership and the Miller Center and the Presidential Ideas Festival. Thanks very much.
Thank you.